Hola a todos, bienvenidos a más un episodio de A varios circuitos de ruta. Hoy exploramos un circuito que ya fue citado varias veces, mas que ainda não consegui contornar até agora. Assim é o Autódromo de Ribeirão Preto, que sedui 4 provas do Stock Brasil de 2010 a 2015. How would you rate my Portuguese there? Please feel free to give me a score out of 10 in the comment section down below. I'm willing to give myself a respectable -54 out of 10. Anyway, terrible pronunciations aside, it's been about time that I took a look at an event for the Brazilian Stock Car Series, because I feel this championship doesn't get enough coverage outside of its homeland, particularly in Europe, which, considering the drivers who compete in these races, is a real shame. That being said, we've got a track to cover. Or perhaps more specifically, tracks to cover. The first iteration of the Ribeirão Preto street circuit, and I may have pronounced the name differently to how I did the first time, was quite interesting to say the least. Now, if you're someone like me who hadn't seen a lot of this track before, the first half of the lap potentially leads you to a false notion that this track doesn't have its quirks. The start-finish straight is quite long, in fact it's easily the longest flat-out portion of track, on the track. The road curves to the left slightly before you're met with a fast, sweeping left-hander. A fantastic corner this one, easily my favourite on the circuit. You get the luxury of a bit of tarmac runoff if you get it wrong, and even better is that you don't have to worry about clipping a hard, unforgiving and merciless turn 1 inside wall on the apex to the corner, because there's a curb that looks like it belongs on a conventional circuit on the inside. And there's some grass, a very rare commodity on street circuits these days. A slightly tighter turn 2 follows, which isn't all that bad, although the sharp angling of the curbs on the outside do look as though they want to devour some splitters. An averagely sized straight is afterwards before you're met with a fiddly section to negotiate. A sharp left-hander, the third in a row, proceeds instantaneously into a much tighter right-hander. How good you do the right-hander is entirely dependent on how much speed you take out of the left-hander, because if you go too fast, well, you've ruined any intentions you had of having a competent right-hander, which is the more important corner of the two to get right. From here on in, though, this track starts to get a bit strange. Whether that's in a good way or not, well, that's up for you to decide. The track now follows a roundabout. This right turn may seem normal enough, however the wall then suddenly just ends, which means there is a possibility of colliding with one of the small trees that are in the centre of this roundabout. Not sure there are many street tracks or racetracks in general that have this feature. Plus, I'm also not sure why there is no wall there. There is a chicane in the middle of the roundabout before you then go into a sharp right-hander, where once again you don't have to worry about clipping the inside wall. The barriers then return to being on both sides of the track as you thunder towards a conventional hairpin. Exiting out of said hairpin, you head towards the roundabouts in the other direction. However, if you're desperate for tyres or fuel, then you have to navigate a pit lane, which I can only describe as being Formula E-esque 4 years before that was even a thing. Then getting back onto the track is an experience in itself. All of this though was to the detriment of track width, as demonstrated here. The lap though was completed once you got back onto the straight, a lap of one of the strangest modern day street circuits I've ever seen. Now the circuit was altered for 2011 and 12, sadly there isn't much footage of it, but alterations were basically the following. Once you got to the roundabout, you'd be exiting at the first exit, not the second exit like you were on the first track. After a very similar hairpin, you then go round a reasonably fast, yet tighter radius, left-hander before going back to the original start-finish straight. The pit lane meanwhile was in the same place, but had a much smoother entry into it. This though wouldn't be the last version of this track. This edition of the track would be somewhat different to its previous iterations. Used for the 2013 and 15 seasons, although not in 2014 due to local elections, the track starts off with a double apex hairpin, my favourite sort of hairpin. The next corner is easily the rarest sort of turn you see on a racetrack, one where it's a win-win situation even if you make a mistake, unless you hit a solid object. The corner is a 90-degree left-hander. First time I've had to mention this type of corner in this video. However, if you lock up and go straight on, then no worries, because you can start out as though you were meaning to take a pit stop, as that's where the pit lane entrance is. If your crew aren't ready, then that's their problem, not yours. Right. Okay, maybe not. Coming out of the corner, you see the pit lane exit on your right hand side, and then the long straight lay ahead of you. A medium speed right-hander follows the straight, although it may not look medium speed from a spectator/TV viewer's perspective in wet conditions. Before you come to a left-hand hairpin which has some grass on the inside that sort of looks as though it hadn't been cut in months beforehand. Then we have a right-hand corner, that really isn't a corner in the slightest, before you head to a turn that looks very similar in dimensions to the previous one you just completed. If it hadn't been for the fancy tunnel, then it would be quite difficult to tell them apart from one another. A small acceleration zone, or in the wet conditions 3 or 4 seconds of having to constantly manage wheel spin, precede a kink to the right, which you certainly can't take any liberties with, before another long straight where you have just one bend left to go. It's nothing exciting, just another 90-degree corner going to the right this time, although at least it's been spiced up a little bit by having a curved exit, so it's not a completely characterless turn. With a lap being completed then, I think we'd ought to talk about this circuit's history, because its original intention was to be appearing on the IndyCar calendar in 2010, due to several of IndyCar's most popular drivers being Brazilian, and in the case of then recently crowned 3 times Indy 500 winner Helio Castroneves, actually being from Ribeirão Preto. In the end though, IndyCar settled on the location of Sao Paulo, which we may come on to in this series later on. However, there was still an appetite to bring street racing to the streets of Ribeirão Preto, hence how the stock car series took up the mantle. And quite frankly, I'm rather relieved that they did, because especially on that first circuit, IndyCars racing around there would have been a sight, let's put it like that. The stock car certainly seemed more suited to this track, although passing did look to be at a premium, with the last iteration of the circuit proving to be slightly better in that regard. Ribeirão Preto would drop off the calendar after 2015, and since then hasn't returned. I mean, as tracks go, it's certainly one of the most intriguing in this series so far. Also what this episode has reminded me is that I'd ought to see a lot more of the stock car series. Now that I know this information, I'm going to go and watch more of it. So, I'll round off the video by saying, thank you very much for watching. If you have any more street tracks that you'd like to see me cover in this series, then say in the comment section down below. However, until the next video, be kind to each other, and enjoy the rest of your day.